Hey, kiddo. I need to ask you a few questions, okay? Can you tell me what happened tonight?
I... I went to show her my haircut. She had a gun.
Take your time.
She freaked out.
It's okay.
No, it's not. It's not okay. My mom tried to kill me, so I stabbed her. I killed my mother.
Okay, first, I'm gonna find the keys to the old house. Then, I'm gonna drive to Fireweed, and I'm not going to freak out. Everything's fine. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Probably not gonna see any stars at this time of day. Not the prettiest of my creations, but she weirdly kind of looks like me, and I could look at this artwork all day. Why would it be in here? Oh, right. I stashed them down here. So that's where you've been hiding. This feels like another lifetime. All right. I think I'm ready to go now.
Allie. She's gonna be so awkward. Can't believe I'm about to leave this room for the last time. Okay, I'm pretty much done here. I just need to pack my goblin figurine. I wonder if Allison still has hers. I just need to pack my goblin figurine. I wonder if Allison still has hers. Denali. I need to get my application ready for next summer. Hey, little guy. You're gonna be reunited with your sister soon. Cool. I guess I'm totally ready to go now.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi. First time we see each other in 10 years, and it's hi, Tyler.
Oh, sorry,
It's fine, Allison. Hi's a good place to start.
God, it's good to see you.
Likewise.
You have anything else you need to get?
Nope, this is it. My last 10 years in a bag.
Then we should get going. We just have time to make the morning ferry. You look good in that.
Thanks. One of my mentees designed it.
It's really good.
Yeah, he's so incredibly talented. I got a couple of local coffee shops to hang his art.
Tyler Ronan, shaping the leaders of tomorrow.
Yep, we're screwed.
So, are you gonna miss anything about this place?
Honestly, people. The other residents, my mentees, my counselor, Aaron. It took me a while to fit in, but once I did, it felt like home. They made me feel safe. Safe enough to be me.
That's so great. I'm really happy for you.
We planning to drive to Delos Crossing or push?
You are welcome to walk.
Nah, I'll take my chances.
Need one last look or anything?
Looked. Let's go.